Close your eyes for a moment. Take a deep breath. Let the day behind you fade into the background, and imagine yourself somewhere else entirely. Not here, not now. But in Europe in the year 1347. The morning air is cool and crisp as you stir awake. You find yourself not in a modern bed with soft sheets, but on a straw-filled mattress, your body warmed only by a woolen blanket, scratchy against your skin. You stretch, slowly, and blink against the dim light filtering through cracks in the shutters. Around you there is no private bedroom. Instead, you share this single, crowded space with the rest of your family. The walls are made of wattle and daub, a wooden frame packed with mud, clay, and straw. It is humble, but it keeps out much of the cold. Above, a thatched roof shelters you, though when the rains fall hard, it sometimes leaks, dripping into little puddles on the dirt floor. The smells of your world are thick and earthy. The smoky trace of last night's fire still lingers in the air. Beneath your feet, the ground gives off its raw, earthen scent. And in the close quarters of your cottage, there is also the smell of unwashed bodies. Not unusual, not unpleasant to you, simply normal. In this time, bathing is rare, and everyone carries the same scent of human labor and daily life. Your stomach rumbles. If you are fortunate, there may be some bread left from yesterday. Hard now, almost like a stone, but it can be softened in a cup of ale. And yes, even the children drink ale. A weak, watered kind, safer than most wells, for water itself often carries sickness. You sip, chew, swallow, and begin another day. Step outside your door, and the village is already alive. You hear the low call of cattle in their pens. Chickens cluck as they scatter across the yard. Neighbors are calling out to one another, voices rough with sleep but ready for the work ahead. Life here is simple but unrelenting. Most people in your village are peasants. Some are free tenants, paying rent to the local lord. Others are serfs, bound to the land itself, owing their labor as payment. The rhythm of life follows a familiar pattern. Sunrise and sunset mark your hours. The church bells mark your weeks, pulling you to Massachusetts. And the seasons, the endless cycle of planting and harvest, mark your years. It is not an easy life. It is hard, exhausting, and sometimes cruel. But it is steady, predictable, familiar. It is the only life you have ever known. What you cannot know, what no one in Europe yet knows, is that this rhythm, this way of life, is about to be broken. Far away, along the trade routes of the East, something stirs. Something invisible but unstoppable. The first hints of it come not in the form of sickness, but of words. A traveling merchant arrives in your village. His cart carries silks, spices, and trinkets from far-off lands. His stories are just as exotic, but this time they are not of wonders. They are of horrors. He speaks of cities ravaged by a strange illness, of fevers that burn the body, of swellings that rise beneath the skin, black and painful, of death that comes quickly, mercilessly. Some villagers cross themselves, whispering prayers under their breath. Others scoff, shaking their heads. After all, tales grow taller the farther they travel. Rumors always move faster than truth. And so the merchant moves on, his words fading like smoke behind him. Life continues. The harvest is brought in. The bells still toll. The days rise and fall in their old familiar rhythm. But the stories do not stop. They come again, carried by other merchants, other travelers. Each time louder, more urgent, more fearful. By the time autumn comes, the whispers have turned to shouts. A shadow is moving across Europe. And soon it will reach even here, to your small, quiet village. Let your breathing settle. Let the present moment slip away. Once more we are in Europe. The year still 1347. The shadow that was once only rumor has grown darker, heavier, and closer. Word comes first from the great ports of the Mediterranean. Messina, Marseilles, Venice. Cities where ships bring the goods of the world. Silks, spices, oils, and wines. But now those ships bring something else. Some arrive into harbor with sails still raised, but no voices calling from the deck. Dockworkers climb aboard, only to find silence. No crew, no captain, only corpses. Men who began their voyage strong and living, now lying cold in tangled heaps, blackened swellings on their bodies. When the news reaches your village, your mother presses her fingers to her forehead, her chest, her shoulders, the sign of the cross, and whispers, "God save us all." No one really understands what is coming, but everyone feels the unease. People prepare in the only ways they know. Some hoard bread and beans, salted meat, whatever can be stored away. Others spend more time in church, lighting candles, kneeling, pleading for protection. The village healer gathers herbs, rosemary, sage, thyme, crushing them into potions and poultices, though whether they will help is anyone's guess. Winter comes, cold and sharp. Then the news grows closer. A village only half a day's walk away is struck. Sudden death, high fevers, terrible thirst, black swellings in the armpits, in the groin. Few survive more than 3 days once the signs appear. Your elders gather. They argue. Should the roads be closed? Should strangers be turned away? But how can a village survive without trade, without news, without the outside world? In the end, nothing is decided. Life goes on. But a thin veil of fear hangs over every face. And then, one morning, it happens. A young man, strong and healthy only yesterday, fails to arrive at the mill. Someone is sent to find him. He is discovered in his bed, drenched in sweat, gasping with fever. On his neck bulges a swelling, the size of a hen's egg, dark and painful. The sickness is here. And what follows is horror beyond imagination, spreads with a speed that seems impossible. A man laughs in the tavern one evening, and is dead before the week is out. A woman feeds her children one morning, and by nightfall lies stiff and cold on her bed of straw. The swellings, the buboes, give the disease its name, the Black Death. They are hard, swollen knots, searingly painful, growing beneath the arms, at the groin, along the neck. Many victims cough blood, the sickness reaching their lungs, stealing their breath. Those who do rarely survive even a day. The people of your time search for meaning. Some call it punishment from God. Men march through the roads, flogging themselves bloody in penance, begging forgiveness for their sins. Others claim it is bad air, poisoned winds that seep into the body. They carry flowers and herbs, pressing them to their noses, hoping to block the invisible poison. And in whispers, dark accusations rise. Some blame the Jews, claiming they have poisoned the wells. Though your village has no Jewish families at all, still the suspicion festers, growing like the sickness itself. The truth, the real truth, is far beyond your world's knowledge. The Black Death is born of a tiny creature, a bacterium known as Yersinia pestis. It hides in the bellies of fleas. Those fleas live on rats, and the rats live everywhere. On ships, in cellars, in granaries, in the very walls of your home. An infected flea bites, regurgitates the invisible enemy into the blood, and from there the body unravels. Sometimes the plague reaches the lungs. Then it leaps from breath to breath, person to person, a storm of death that no herb, no prayer, no ritual can stop. But you do not know this. You cannot know this. All you see are your neighbors dying, your family suffering, the world collapsing. The church bells that once marked the gentle passing of time now toll constantly, first for one death, then another, until there are too many. And then, at last, the bells fall silent. Funerals vanish. Priests cannot keep pace. The dead are gathered quickly, sometimes by strangers, sometimes by family too weak with grief to resist. The bodies are laid on carts, stacked one atop another, and carried away to pits in the earth. Mass graves. No candles, no prayers. Only earth piled high over those who once lived, worked, prayed, and dreamed in your village. The rhythm of life that once seemed eternal is gone. And in its place, only the sound of coughing, of weeping, of the heavy wooden wheels of the death carts rolling past your door. Settle yourself, let your breath grow steady. The candles of our story flicker low, and we return once more to your village in the year 1348. The Black Death has arrived, and it lingers still. Some families, broken by too many deaths, have no one left to bury their own. The bodies remain where they fell, in cottages, in barns, on straw beds. 4 days, sometimes longer. The air grows heavy with the scent of decay until neighbors or parish officials are forced to take the grim task upon themselves. Fear begins to shape every action, every choice. Those with healthy kin keep their doors barred, refusing visitors, unwilling to risk even a touch. Families with sickness in their homes are shunned, left to face their fate alone. The bond of neighbor to neighbor, so strong in ordinary times, frays under the weight of terror. Some flee, abandoning the village altogether, hoping the open countryside or some distant town might shelter them. Others turn inward, clinging to faith with desperate intensity. In the streets of towns and cities, you would see processions of flagellants, men stripped to the waist, lashing themselves bloody with ropes and whips. Each blow a plea, a prayer, an attempt to appease what they believe is God's wrath upon the world. The priests, who should bring comfort, are themselves overwhelmed. Many take ill and die, their work exposing them constantly to the sick and the dying. Some flee, unable to face the endless tide of death. Others remain, brave but doomed, offering last rites until the plague takes them as well. Your own family has been spared so far. You have heard the stories of entire households gone within a week, of children left orphaned only to follow their parents into the grave, of lovers separated by death mere hours after pledging eternal devotion. But your luck, like all luck in these times, cannot last forever. One morning your younger brother stirs, pale and restless. His voice is weak as he whispers that he does not feel well. By midday, his forehead burns with fever. By evening, the swelling is visible at his neck, dark and hard, the size of an egg. There is no doubt. The plague has found him. Your mother does what she can. She tends to him constantly, bathing his brow with cool cloths, coaxing him to sip water or ale. Your father speaks of taking him to the monastery, but all know that the brothers are overwhelmed, the infirmary overflowing, the monks themselves collapsing one by one. 3 days pass. The swelling grows, angry red then black. His breathing grows harsh. He mutters and cries out, caught between delirium and pain. You want to stay by his side, but fear holds you back. Each hour feels as though the air itself is poisoned. And then, something shifts. On the 4th day, when most victims are at the brink of death, his fever breaks. He wakes, eyes clearer, voice rasping but steady. The swelling softens. Over the next days, it ruptures and drains. Disgusting, yes, but life-saving. Against all odds, your brother survives. You do not know why. None of you could possibly know. But centuries later, scientists would discover the truth. A hidden advantage within his very blood. A small mutation, known as Delta 32, altering a protein on the surface of his white blood cells. By sheer chance, this quirk of nature gave him protection that most others lacked. It shielded him from the worst of the plague. And as history would one day reveal, it would also shield some of his distant descendants from another deadly disease. A sickness called HIV, unknown until 600 years later. But here, in 1348, all you can see is a miracle. Your family rejoices, relief washing through your small cottage. A scar will remain at your brother's neck, deep and dark, a reminder of how near death he came. Yet a scar is far better than a grave. Still, the world outside your door is unrecognizable. Your village, once home to perhaps 200 souls, is now fewer than 100. Gardens grow wild, fields lie untended, barns stand empty. The blacksmith's hammer, the weaver's loom, the miller's wheel, the familiar sounds of daily labor are muted, or gone entirely. The lord of the manor, in his stone hall upon the hill, has lost his wife and 2 of his children. Even wealth, even power, cannot bar death from the door. Strangely, some people seem untouchable. The gravedigger, a rough, unpleasant man who strips the dead of rings and coins before lowering them into the earth, never shows a sign of illness, though he handles plague-ridden corpses every day. A midwife, who tends to the sick when not delivering infants, also remains healthy despite constant exposure. You think of them as lucky. Medieval minds may call them blessed or else cursed, imagining secret dealings with dark forces. But in truth, they may carry the same hidden shield your brother carries in his blood. As the weeks drag on, food becomes scarce. With fewer to plant and harvest, grain is short, livestock neglected. The price of simple goods soars. Anything believed to hold healing power, herbs, ointments, relics, becomes impossibly expensive. Families trade what little they have, desperate for remedies that rarely work. Then, as winter deepens, something unexpected happens. The plague seems to loosen its grip. Fleas grow sluggish in the cold. Rats stay nestled in their nests. For the first time in months, there is hope. Perhaps people whisper the worst is over. But the Black Death is not finished. It withdraws only to gather strength, waiting for spring. With the warming air, it returns, sweeping again through homes and villages, finding those who survived the first wave. From 1347 until 1351, wave after wave will strike. Across Europe, somewhere between 75 and 200 million people will die. Perhaps half the population. Entire communities erased. Entire regions transformed. And yet, those who endure, like your brother, like the midwife, like the gravedigger, they will be the ones to shape what comes after. The feudal order will shake. The value of labor will rise. The authority of the church will weaken, questioned by people who saw their prayers go unanswered. And the practice of medicine itself will begin, slowly, to turn away from superstition toward something new. But for tonight, those changes lie far ahead. For now, you sit outside your cottage at dusk, your brother weak but alive beside you. The fields are quiet, the village small, diminished, scarred. Above, the first stars pierce the darkening sky. And even after so much death, one truth remains. Life continues. It always does. Humanity endures, adapts, carries on. The seasons turn once more. Winter settles in, with its bitter winds and early nights. Your village, though smaller now, continues on. On market days, farmers from outlying hamlets bring what they've managed to harvest. Baskets of grain, onions, turnips, apples stored in root cellars. A traveling merchant arrives too, braver, or perhaps more reckless than most. His cart carries salt and spices, fabrics and trinkets. But more than goods, he brings news. Everywhere, he says, the story is the same. First, devastation. Then, a slow, hesitant recovery. No place has been spared. Cities, with their crowded streets and poor sanitation, suffered the worst. Monasteries fell silent, every monk dead in his cell. Noble families, their lineages stretching back centuries, cut short in a single season. Ghost towns stand empty, houses abandoned, churches locked, fields gone to weeds. And yet, there are places where life continues almost as before. Places where neighbors pull together, caring for widows and orphans, feeding the weak, comforting the grieving. Even in the shadow of death, kindness has not entirely vanished. One story the merchant tells seizes your imagination. In a village much like your own, he says, there was a woman named Elizabeth. In one terrible week, she lost her husband and all 6 of her children. Alone, she dragged each body to a hillside behind her cottage, dug the graves with her own hands, and buried them one by one. And yet, she never became sick. Not once. The people whispered, how could she touch so much death and still live? Some claimed she was a witch. They muttered of drowning her in the pond. But most were simply grateful. Grateful that someone was willing to bury the bodies, when no one else dared. Your father, listening by the fire, shakes his head firmly. No witchcraft in survival, he says. Some are simply stronger. Like my son. He places a proud hand on your brother's shoulder, the boy who endured when so many others did not. The merchant only nods, careful not to argue with a customer. True enough, he says softly. In every village, there are those the plague cannot touch. God's chosen, perhaps. But what you cannot know What no one in the 14th century can yet imagine is that people like Elizabeth, the gravedigger, the midwife, your brother, all may share the same hidden trait, a genetic key passed down by chance, granting them a measure of protection against the sickness that killed millions. As the cold months deepen, your village learns to live in its new shape. There are fewer mouths to feed, a strange blessing in these lean times, but also fewer hands to work. Every task, every chore weighs heavier on the survivors. Wood must still be chopped, animals tended, roofs patched, carts repaired. This scarcity of labor begins to change things. Quietly at first, but unmistakably. Your father, a skilled carpenter, finds himself suddenly in demand. The lord of the manor, whose stone house looms over the fields, once would have commanded his service without question. Now he must bargain. 1 silver penny, your father says one evening, disbelief in his voice. 3 days' work on the manor roof, and a side of bacon besides. Such payment would have been unthinkable before the plague. But half the craftsmen in the region are gone, and those who remain know their worth. The change ripples outward. Farmhands, once plentiful and easily replaced, now ask higher wages. Household servants, especially those skilled at running large homes, are suddenly precious. Even women, so often bound to house and hearth, begin to step into roles once reserved for men, managing farms, taking trades, learning skills in demand. The old order, shaken by death, no longer stands quite so firm. And though you cannot yet see where it will lead, the world that emerges from the ashes of the Black Death will not be the same as the one that came before. The winter passes, and spring returns again. The air softens, the fields green, and the first flowers push through the earth. Yet with the beauty of the season comes a shadow of fear. For as warmth returns, so too does the plague. Widows, once expected to remarry quickly, often choose a different path now. Many keep their independence, running the shops or workshops left behind by husbands lost to the sickness. Guild rules that once barred women from trades are quietly set aside. Survival outweighs tradition. In a nearby village, a woman steps into her husband's forge, lifting the hammer and taking up the work of a blacksmith. Some call it scandal, others call it salvation. For without her, there would be no tools, no nails, no horseshoes. Even for those bound by law to the land, the world has shifted. Serfs, who once had no freedom, find themselves in demand. Some lords, desperate to keep their fields productive, offer them freedom if they agree to stay. Others simply slip away, moving to towns, to other estates, seeking better lives. With so many dead, enforcement of the old rules has grown weak. The bonds of feudalism, centuries old, begin to fray. Not all at once, but the seeds of change are planted here, in these years after the plague. In your own family, life takes on new rhythms. Your brother regains his strength, though he is slower now, his brush with death leaving him marked. Your father's carpentry is more valuable than ever. The manor house needs repairs, barns need rebuilding, coffers and carts must be mended. The lord, who once commanded, now bargains, offering wages and even food in exchange for skilled hands. Your mother takes in laundry from the manor, her work too better paid than in the past. And you, unusual for a peasant child, find yourself at the side of the priest, helping to keep the parish records. Your mother's lessons in reading and writing, rare gifts in a village such as this, now set you apart. But with spring's warmth comes more than new opportunities. It brings the second wave. By early summer, sickness returns. It is not as fierce as before. Fewer people remain to infect, and some who survived may carry hidden protections. Still, each death tears open wounds barely healed. You sit beside the priest one afternoon, helping him update the death register. The parchment is filled with names, lines of ink marking lives lost. Alas, you cannot keep silent. "Father," you ask softly, "why did God send the plague?" The priest looks at you, his eyes weary, his face lined with grief. He dips his quill in ink, but does not write. "Some say it is punishment for sin," he says at length. "Others that it is a test of faith. The Holy Father himself calls for prayer, for penance. He sighs, adding another name to the long list. But I have seen the most devout die in agony, while sinners live untouched. I have prayed over the beds of innocent children, and still they died. He sets down the quill, hands trembling. Perhaps, he whispers, it is not for us to understand God's plan. Such doubts are not yours alone. Across Europe, faith itself trembles. If the plague is divine punishment, why does it strike the virtuous and the sinful alike? If prayer is the cure, why do whole monasteries perish despite their devotion? The Church, long unquestioned, begins to show cracks. Medicine fares no better. Learned doctors, trained in the great universities, fail just as surely as humble healers. Their theories of humors, their charts of stars explain nothing. Some physicians stand bravely at the bedsides of the sick, giving their lives in the attempt. Others flee. Those who stay often don strange new garb, waxed robes, gloves, and masks shaped like the beak of a bird, filled with herbs and spices to purify the air. To later generations, these figures will become the very image of the plague. But in truth, their herbs protect them no more than prayers or charms. Communities left to themselves try their own measures. Some hang charms and talismans, or avoid unlucky signs. Others take steps that, though born of fear, have real value. Sick houses marked with crosses. Visitors forced to wait outside the village for 3 days. The belongings of the dead burned. These precautions cannot halt the plague entirely, but they slow its spread, saving some lives. Still, by midsummer, a dozen more villagers are gone. Among them, the lord of the manor. He had survived the first wave, only to fall in the second. His death shakes more than his household, for in his place comes his son, young, barely 20, freshly returned from study in Paris. This new lord sees the world differently. He knows labor is scarce, and he knows the value of those who remain. He offers better rents, freedom to those who were once bound, privileges once reserved for his social equals. Your father, for the first time in his life, is treated not as a servant but as a man whose skill carries weight. Not every lord is so wise. In neighboring estates, others cling to the old ways. They tighten restrictions, punish peasants who ask for more, attempt to bind them to the land with threats and force. But such efforts fail. For the survivors now know their worth. Fields are wide and laborers few. They leave and find better elsewhere. By autumn the second wave fades. Your village, though scarred, still stands. Where once there were 200 souls, now perhaps 90 remain. Houses lie empty, slowly collapsing, their timbers scavenged. Fields are consolidated, the best land farmed, the rest abandoned. And yet life returns. Children play once more in the square. Weddings are celebrated, babies born. Trade begins again, cautious but steady. One clear autumn day, a traveler arrives. A mason, once of your village, who had left long ago for the cities. He tells of Florence, of its splendor, and of its ruin. I watched half the city die, he says, voice heavy. The rich fled, but the poor had nowhere to go. The streets were filled with bodies. They could not bury them fast enough. His eyes grow distant, haunted. I survived. I do not know why. But when the work of burying was done, when the plague had eased, the cathedral stood unfinished. The builders gone. There was no place for me there anymore. So I have returned home. The story chills the village, yet it also comforts. For in his words, you hear the truth spoken by every survivor, in every place. Death has passed for now. And where life remains, it must go on. The mason's return is no small event. His presence alone is proof of how deeply the plague has reshaped Europe. For centuries, men like him had flowed steadily from countryside to city, drawn by stone walls, churches under construction, bustling markets, and steady pay. Now the current has reversed. Survivors leave the crowded alleys of towns and return to the open spaces of their birth. He is not alone in this. Across Europe, rural parishes begin receiving their sons and daughters back again. Weavers from Bruges, apprentices from Paris, merchants' clerks from Genoa. Some come home because they lost everything in the city. Others because they believe country air is safer. All bring more than just their hands. They carry knowledge, stories, and perspectives. Around the fire, the mason describes Florence not as a noble's domain, but as a city ruled by men of trade, merchants who rise not from ancient bloodlines but from skill and wealth. He tells of mechanical clocks, iron gears turning with relentless precision, bells marking hours the way church bells once marked only prayer. He explains how water runs through stone conduits, clear and constant, and how banks hold money in one place but make it spendable in another. For your family, these stories are astonishing, and they matter. For the plague has not just emptied fields and houses, it has opened minds. The old answers feel brittle now, unable to explain why priests died while thieves lived, why prayers failed but isolation worked. Into those cracks, new thoughts slip like seeds. Your brother listens most closely. His narrow escape from death left him restless, unwilling to return simply to hoeing fields. Apprenticing with the mason gives him purpose. Stonework, he learns, is not only about strength but about balance and proportion. He dreams of shaping arches that rise higher than trees, of walls that endure centuries. Your father's carpentry is likewise transformed. No longer a service demanded under feudal duty. His skill now earns wages: silver coins, salted meat, even rare cloth. Such pay would once have gone only to guild masters in towns. Now, in the shortage left by plague, even a village carpenter commands it. Your mother, who once bent over laundry for noble households, now tends an herb garden thick with sage, yarrow, and rosemary. Healers are scarce, and her remedies, teas to calm fever, poultices for swelling, are in demand. Folk call her to their homes, not as a servant, but as someone with knowledge to be respected. And you, the child with letters, sit at the priest's side, ink-stained and quick-handed. Each death, each baptism, each marriage you record in the register. Once, your birth would have sealed your fate. A peasant's child could be clever as any monk and still spend life bent over a plow. But in this broken, reforming world, need reshapes destiny. Literacy itself has become a form of wealth. One night, your family shares a meal richer than any you can remember. Fresh bread, salted pork, beans thick in broth. The fire burns bright, the shadows warm rather than fearful. And yet, beneath the comfort lies unease. It is a terrible thing to say, your father admits, staring into the flames. But life is better for us now than before. Your mother nods slowly. More food, better pay, more freedom. She hesitates, her voice low. All built on graves. It is the paradox whispered across Europe. For those who lived, life has improved. Wages high, land plentiful, freedom greater. Yet every gain is shadowed by memory. Neighbors lost, families broken, churches half empty. The riches of survival cannot be separated from the cost. As sleep comes, you lie beneath the thatch roof, the scarred face of your brother across the room, the steady breathing of your parents nearby. You wonder what world lies ahead. Will the cracks in the old order grow wider? Will the ideas carried back from Florence take root in villages like yours? Will children yet unborn live in a freer world? Or will the lords and priests stitch back their old power? The questions drift with you into dreams. For now, you are only a survivor in a world still balancing between ruin and renewal. But the path you walk is toward a different age, one shaped not by the certainties of the past, but by the uncertainties born of plague. 3 centuries have passed since your family in the 14th century survived the Black Death's first great onslaught. The scars of that time have long since weathered into memory, but the disease itself has never entirely vanished. Bubonic plague lingers, surfacing in outbreaks large and small, carried by the same unseen messengers of flea and rat. By 1665, England is no stranger to it. Yet the villagers of Eyam, a modest settlement in the Derbyshire hills, still imagine themselves sheltered by distance. Life here is steady, almost timeless. The church bells of St. Lawrence mark the passing of Sundays. Children scramble across limestone walls, chasing one another with wooden hoops. Men spend their days farming small plots, or digging deep into the earth for lead or hard, dirty work, but dependable. Women tend gardens, spin wool, bake bread in stone hearths. In the tavern, miners share news over ale, voices carrying late into the night. Families have lived side by side for generations. Bonds of kinship and neighborly trust are strong. But change is moving quietly, invisibly, along trade routes that connect even this isolated parish to the wider world. In London, plague has returned in terrifying force. By year's end, it will claim 100,000 souls, nearly a quarter of the capital. Once more, the streets of a great city echo with the same grim sounds your medieval ancestors knew. The rattle of death carts, the tolling of bells, the cries of grief. The people of Eyam hear whispers of this calamity. Some shake their heads, pitying Londoners for their crowded lanes and filthy alleys. Such things will not trouble us here, they think. After all, Eyam lies far from the bustling roads of commerce. The hills that enclose the village feel like walls against the world. And then, sometime in late summer, a bolt of cloth arrives from London. Ordered by the village tailor, it seems harmless enough. Bright patterned fabric to be cut and sewn into garments. But within its folds lurk fleas carrying death. The tailor's assistant, a young man full of life and laughter, soon falls ill. His fever burns, his skin erupts with black swellings. Within days he is dead. At first, people murmur that it must be some ordinary sickness, a fever from foul air, or perhaps divine punishment for hidden sins. Yet as more fall ill, denial crumbles. The plague has come to Eyam. The same disease that tore through Europe in 1347 now stalks this quiet valley. Fear spreads faster than the sickness. Families whisper about fleeing to neighboring villages, carrying what few belongings they can load onto carts. Parents wonder whether to send their children away. The tavern grows hushed, the church pews half empty, as people weigh their choices. But plague is never just about survival of the body. It is also a test of conscience. What happens next in Eyam, the decisions its villagers make in the weeks to come, will etch their name forever into history. For this tiny community is about to choose a path of sacrifice almost unimaginable, one that will preserve the lives of others even as it costs them dearly. For now, though they do not yet know, the tailor's assistant has died. The air feels heavy, as though the hills themselves hold their breath. And with each passing day, more homes fall silent. Fate had arrived in the folds of damp cloth. By autumn, the village of Eyam, once peaceful, close-knit, and confident in its distance from the world's dangers, is transformed into a crucible of fear and resolve. The first grave, dug for George Vickers on that early September day, is soon joined by many more. Each week, more names vanish from the parish roll. The sound of shovels striking rocky ground becomes as familiar as the toll of the church bell. Death is no longer an exception but a rhythm. In ordinary times, the instinct would be to flee. In London, nobles and merchants had escaped the plague-ridden city, seeking fresh air in country estates. King Charles II himself had abandoned his people, retreating with his court to safer pastures. In Eyam, some wealthier households prepare to do the same, packing valuables and arranging passage. Yet at this moment of crisis, two unlikely allies rise above old quarrels. The Reverend William Mompesson, young and recently appointed rector of Eyam, and his predecessor Thomas Stanley, a Puritan minister long at odds with the Church of England, come together. Their theological differences, once a cause for division, are set aside in the face of a common enemy. Side by side, they stand before the frightened villagers and propose something almost unimaginable. No one shall leave. No one shall enter. Food will be brought and left at marked boundary stones. Payment will be left in vinegar-soaked hollows, in the hope that the sour liquid will cleanse away contagion. The village will live and die within its own borders, containing the plague so it cannot ravage the surrounding countryside. The choice is stark. To accept quarantine is to accept death for many. But to refuse is to spread the sickness to countless others. Against every instinct of survival, the villagers agree. In that moment, Eyam writes itself into history. And so begins a long, bitter vigil. Through the winter of 1665, the plague lingers like a shadow. Some days pass with no new graves, and hope dares to flicker. Then a household is struck, and within days its members are gone. Entire families vanish. Father, mother, children, all buried in hastily dug pits behind cottages, or beneath orchard trees, or in meadows where sheep graze. The churchyard cannot hold them all. By spring of 1666, the toll is unmistakable. Streets once alive with voices are hushed. Doors remain barred. Smoke rises from fewer chimneys. Children's laughter is gone, replaced by the sobs of survivors mourning yet another loss. In some cottages, the dead lie unburied for days, their neighbors too fearful to help. Yet even amid horror, there is resilience. At the boundary stones, the Earl of Devonshire's men leave sacks of grain, wheels of cheese, jars of salt. Villagers, faces drawn and eyes wary, creep out to collect them. Payment, precious coins soaked in vinegar, is placed carefully into the carved hollows of the rock. These silent exchanges become lifelines, threads connecting Eyam to a world it has vowed not to endanger. Inside the village, faith and doubt wrestle. Some believe the suffering is divine punishment, others a trial of endurance. Families pray in fields, not daring to gather in the church. Reverend Mompesson holds services in the open air, his voice carrying across the wind so that his congregation may keep their distance. In the silence that follows each sermon, the hills themselves seem to bear witness. Summer comes again, but with no relief. The plague shows no mercy. In August of 1666, nearly a year since George Vickers' death, the village endures its most devastating weeks. Whole households are extinguished. At its peak, bodies are buried almost daily. Grave diggers collapse with exhaustion. Survivors whisper that perhaps none will remain when the sickness finally lifts. But still, not a single villager breaks the quarantine. In this choice, this collective act of sacrifice, lies Eyam's legacy. For while within its borders the death toll rises unbearably, beyond them the surrounding villages are spared. The cordon sanitaire holds. The plague burns itself out, consuming Eyam but going no further. By the time the sickness finally ebbs in the autumn of 1666, more than 260 of Eyam's 800 souls are gone. The churchyard is crowded, the cottages thinned, the very heart of the village hollowed by loss. And yet Eyam lives. Enough survive to bury the dead, to rebuild homes, to sow seed for the next harvest. The price has been unbearable, the gift incalculable. Eyam's story, born in tragedy, becomes legend, a testament to the human capacity for sacrifice, endurance, and solidarity in the face of terror. The summer of 1666 is merciless. The sun warms the limestone hills and ripens the fields, but in Eyam it shines upon grief. By now, every villager knows someone buried in shallow ground. Every family has an empty chair. Yet within the sorrow, certain stories rise above the rest, etched into memory like names carved into stone. At Riley Farm, Elizabeth Hancock becomes a figure of almost mythic endurance. In just over a week, she watches plague carry off her husband and all 6 of her children. No neighbor dares to help her. The fear of contagion is too great. Alone, she drags each body to a nearby field, the earth heavy beneath her shovel, her tears mixing with sweat. She buries them one by one, 7 graves in a row. That she survives, never falling ill, seems a miracle to her contemporaries. To us, centuries later, science offers another explanation. She may have carried the CCR5 delta 3-2 mutation, a small twist in her DNA that barred the plague bacillus from her cells. But no genetic code can explain the iron will it took to lift and bury her entire world. The Riley graves, still standing today, are her silent monument. Not all stories are so noble. Marshall Howe, Eyam's gravedigger, becomes infamous for his grim occupation. He buries dozens, perhaps hundreds, often stripping valuables from the dead before lowering them into the ground. Some villagers despise him, others merely tolerate him. Yet his survival defies reason. He walks into plague-struck cottages, handles corpse after corpse, and never falls ill. In his own way, How To may be a genetic survivor, protected by the same invisible mutation that shielded Elizabeth Hancock. His legacy is darker, but still part of the village's strange tapestry of fate. There are tales of love, too, doomed but unforgettable. Young Emmett Siddall, trapped within the cordon, meets her sweetheart Roland Torrey at Cucklet Dell, a ravine on the edge of the parish. They cannot touch, cannot cross the boundary that keeps Eam isolated, but they call to one another across the gulf, words carried on the wind. Through autumn, winter, and into spring their distant meetings continue. Then one day Roland calls and Emmett does not come. She has been claimed by the plague. He waits day after day until the truth reaches him. Their story becomes one of Eam's most haunting legends. Love faithful even unto silence. There are stranger tales still. Margaret Blackwell, racked with fever and abandoned as good as dead by her brother, staggers to her kitchen. In delirium, she mistakes a pot of bacon fat for milk and drinks deeply. Against all odds, she recovers. The village whispers that bacon fat cured her. In truth, she likely carried natural resistance and would have survived regardless. But in a time when medicine failed and hope was rare, such stories became talismans, reminders that survival could come from the unlikeliest sources. And at the heart of it all stands Reverend William Mompesson. He had convinced the villagers to stay, to choose sacrifice over escape. In doing so, he ensured that hundreds would die, his own beloved wife Catherine among them. She contracts plague while tending the sick and dies in August 1666. Mompesson holds her as the fever burns her life away. In a letter to his children, safely sent away before the quarantine, he confesses his broken spirit. The condition of this place is very sad. I am not in a condition to receive comfort from you. I am so weak I can write no more. Yet even in grief, he does not abandon Eam. He leads outdoor services at Cucklet Dell, where fresh air is thought to carry less danger. His voice, heavy with sorrow, echoes across the limestone ravine to the scattered congregation. Families standing apart, faces lined with loss, yet still listening, still holding to faith. By September 1666, the plague's grip at last begins to loosen. The killing slows. Autumn rains wash the village clean. When it finally ends, Eam has lost more than 260 of its 800 souls. Entire families are gone, cottages empty, meadows quiet. Yet the plague has not spread beyond the village's borders. Neighboring towns are spared. The sacrifice is complete. When November 1666 arrives, and the last cases of plague finally burn themselves out, silence settles over Eam. It is not the peaceful hush of a winter's night but the hollow quiet of absence. Over 450 villagers are gone. Mothers, fathers, children, entire bloodlines erased in less than 15 months. Empty cottages stand with their doors hanging open. Fields once busy with harvest lie uncut, their grain fallen and spoiled. The air carries the faint, acrid smell of smoke from belongings burned in futile attempts to halt the contagion. Yet amid this devastation, the survivors stir. They have no choice. Hunger does not wait for grief. Winter looms. And so, they begin the slow, painful work of rebuilding. Orphans are folded into households of distant kin or kindly neighbors. A widow may take in another widow's children. A widower remarries, not only for companionship but to create a stable household for survival. These new families are patchworks stitched together from tragedy, but they carry life forward. Property questions emerge. With whole families gone, who now owns the land, the animals, the tools? In many cases, the Earl of Devonshire steps in, redistributing fields to surviving tenants. For some, this brings opportunity. Land that would once have been unreachable is now within grasp. For others, it is a bitter inheritance, gained only because neighbors or kin lie in the churchyard. Work must resume. The lead mines reopen, there or needed for trade. Farmers return to their neglected plots, plowing around the graves that dot their fields. The smithy fires its forge again. The tavern serves ale once more. Life, though scarred, finds its rhythm. But the village is changed. There are fewer voices in the church on Sunday. Familiar faces are missing from the marketplace. Whole lanes feel abandoned, their cottages collapsing into stone skeletons. Even children's games in the square are quieter, fewer shouts rising into the air. And yet Eyam endures. Sparkles the legacy they could not see sparkles. The villagers who survived could not know that they had written themselves into history. They could not foresee that their act of collective sacrifice, choosing quarantine rather than flight, saved thousands in Derbyshire and beyond. Nor could they imagine that their village would be remembered long after the plague itself faded from England. They certainly could not know that centuries later, scientists would study their descendants and find unusually high frequencies of the CCR5 delta 3-2 mutation, the very genetic quirk that protected some, like Elizabeth Hancock and Marshall Howe, from infection. In this, Eyam stands not only as a monument to courage but also as a chapter in the story of human evolution. Nor could they know that in the 21st century, when the world faced its own pandemic, Eyam's story would find new life. Their decision to endure isolation, to bear loss for the sake of strangers, would echo across the centuries as a reminder of what communities can choose when confronted with invisible enemies. For the survivors themselves, however, none of this mattered. What mattered was the next harvest, the next winter's firewood, the rebuilding of homes and lives. They were not thinking of history or of genetics or of pandemics yet to come. They were thinking only of how to live after so much death. And somehow they did. When the plague finally loosens its grip in late 1666, the village of Eyam is a place transformed, not only by the silence of so many empty cottages, but by the weight of memory that hangs in the air. The survivors, few as they are, look around and realize that their world has been reshaped forever. Over time, distant relatives begin to arrive, summoned by letters or by whispers carried through the Derbyshire hills. They come to claim abandoned property, to rebuild houses that had fallen into disrepair, and in doing so, they bring fresh life to a community that might otherwise have dwindled away. With them come new skills and energy, and slowly, the village begins to breathe again. Those who remain from the old Eyam find themselves in high demand. A farmer with strong arms, a weaver with deft hands, a miner willing to descend into the dark shafts of the earth. All are suddenly precious. They command higher wages, better terms, more freedom than ever before. In this way, the plague has worked a grim kind of natural selection. Those who survived, whether through genetic resistance, blind luck, or circumstance, become the foundation of a reborn Eyam. Their descendants, carrying silent traces of this survival in their very blood, will live on long after the plague has faded into history. But not all wounds can be seen. Elizabeth Hancock, the farmer's wife who in the span of 8 terrible days buried her husband and 6 children with her own hands, eventually remarries and bears more children. Yet her neighbors remark that she is never quite the same. They say her eyes sometimes wander into the distance, as though she sees ghosts only she can recognize. The memory of that week, of shoveling earth over the people she loved most, never leaves her. Marshall Howe, the gravedigger who plundered as much as he buried, survives against all odds. But peace brings a reckoning. His immunity, once admired, is now overshadowed by the memory of his looting. People nod politely but keep their distance. He has cheated death, but in doing so, he has lost the trust of his neighbors. William Mompesson, the rector who had persuaded the village to stay behind its boundary stones, does not escape untouched either. Though he survives, he carries a grief deeper than words. His wife, Catherine, had stood by him, helping the sick until the plague finally claimed her. In 1669, broken by sorrow, Mompesson leaves Eyam to take a new post elsewhere. He remarries and lives to the age of 71, but in his private letters, he writes often of those dark months, of the toll they exacted, and of the sacrifice that cost him his beloved Catherine. As for Eyam itself, the village slowly recovers its population. New children are born, new households formed, though some family names vanish forever from its records. The quarantine, the great act of self-sacrifice that saved thousands in the surrounding countryside, becomes part of local lore, passed down with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Hourglass not done, from memory to monument. Hourglass not done. Centuries pass. England changes. Monarchs rise and fall. Industry reshapes the land. And yet Eames' story is not forgotten. In the 19th century, Victorian England, with its deep fascination for moral lessons and historical curiosities, rediscovers the tale of the Plague Village. Writers and antiquarians visit Eames, fascinated by the account of a community that chose to seal itself off from the world. Soon visitors begin to arrive, curious to see the places where it all happened. The Riley Graves, where Elizabeth Hancock laid her family to rest. The Boundary Stones, where coins were left in vinegar to pay for food. The old cottages where silence once reigned. These places become informal monuments to courage and loss. By the 20th and 21st centuries, Eames is not only a quiet Derbyshire village of stone cottages and flower gardens, but also a living museum. Its story is told in the parish church, where artifacts and commemorations are displayed. A local museum gathers together relics, records, and testimonies. Each year since 1866, a Plague Sunday service is held, marking the village's sacrifice and ensuring that its story is never forgotten. And remarkably, some descendants of those survivors still live in Eames. The Hancocks, the Siddalls, the Blackwells, names etched into the records of 1665 to 1666, can still be found in the parish registers. In recent decades, genetic testing has confirmed what history long suspected. Many descendants of Eames carry the CCR5 delta 32 mutation, the tiny alteration in DNA that likely shielded some of their ancestors from plague. The survival of the village, in other words, is written not only in its monuments but in its very bloodline. Milky Way Eames, enduring lesson. Milky Way. The story of Eames reminds us that history is not a dry list of dates or kings and queens. It is the lived experience of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. It is neighbors choosing to stay when every instinct told them to flee. It is parents burying children, lovers separated by quarantine, a community bound together by shared sacrifice. What gives Eames' story such enduring power is not that the villagers thought of legacy. They didn't act so their names would be remembered in plaques or museums. They acted simply out of duty to those beyond their hills, strangers who would never know the cost. And perhaps that is what makes their sacrifice so moving. They were not saints, not heroes untouched by fear. They were ordinary people who loved, who grieved, who stumbled, who despaired. But in a moment of crisis, they chose solidarity over survival at any cost. Today Eames is peaceful. Its cottages are trimmed with gardens. Its hillsides roll gently beneath the English sky, and children play where once silence reigned. Yet in the church, in the Boundary Stones, in the carefully tended Riley Graves, the past is still present. Every visitor who walks those paths carries away the same lesson, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. And so, Eames endures, both as a village and as a story. A reminder that even in humanity's darkest chapters, there is light enough to guide the way forward. Waxing crescent moon. Europe after the Black Death. C. 1352 Waxing crescent moon. The plague has finally receded, leaving silence in its wake. It is 1352, and the continent is raw with grief. Entire villages lie abandoned, their cottages collapsing beneath the weight of neglect, their fields swallowed by thistles and nettles. In places, it seems as though the hand of God has pressed down upon the earth and erased whole communities. But in the village we have been following, though hollowed by death, life endures. Of the 200 who once lived here, only 90 remain. They walk among the ruins of their neighbors' homes with a strange mixture of sorrow and opportunity. For every empty cottage is both a reminder of death and an opening for the living. Sheaf of rice, the transformation of the fields. Sheaf of rice. Before the plague, hunger had been the constant companion of the peasantry. Population growth across the 13th and early 14th centuries had driven farmers to cultivate even the poorest soils, thin, stony patches on hillsides, damp ground prone to flooding, sandy tracts that produced little more than straw. Families worked desperately to wring enough grain from the land to keep stomachs from growling, paying tithes to the church and rents to their lord, often leaving little for themselves. Now the balance has shifted. With so many dead, land is no longer scarce. Survivors abandon the least productive plots and turn their attention to the richest soils, where the earth yields more generously for the same effort. In a single season, the harvest improves. For the first time in memory, families find themselves with grain to spare after dues are paid. And more than grain, many peasants begin converting cropland into pasture. Sheep and cattle graze where once barley and rye had grown thin. Meat, cheese, milk, and butter, once luxuries found only on feast days, now appear regularly on village tables. Children who might once have grown pale and stunted on a diet of gruel begin to grow taller, stronger. Within a generation, the very bodies of Europeans will bear the imprint of this catastrophe. Bones in future graves will show that average height and overall nutrition improved after the plague. Balance scale, labor, lords, and new bargains balance scale. If the fields show one transformation, the relationship between those who work them and those who claim ownership reveals another, deeper change. Before the plague, peasants and serfs were bound tightly to the will of their lords. Labor was abundant. If one worker died or fled, another could be found easily. Rents were fixed, wages low, bargaining power non-existent. The feudal system, already centuries old, rested upon this imbalance. But plague mortality tears the system apart. With half the workforce gone, labor suddenly becomes precious. A carpenter, a plowman, a weaver, each one is now indispensable. The lord of the manor, who once would have commanded service without question, finds himself bargaining instead. To keep the remaining tenants from leaving, he offers better terms. Reduced rents, extra land, sometimes even outright freedom from old feudal obligations. Some lords resist, clinging to the old order with harsh laws and punishments. They try to forbid peasants from moving away, to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, to insist that the dead return to their fields through the hands of their surviving kin. But these efforts rarely succeed. The world has shifted. Laborers walk away from oppressive manners and find others eager to welcome them. With so much land empty, opportunity beckons everywhere. It is in this moment, in these bargains struck in the ashes of catastrophe, that the long decline of serfdom begins. It will take centuries to unfold, but the seeds are planted here in the early 1350s, among the weeds sprouting in abandoned fields. Meat on bone, the small comforts of survivors meat on bone. Around the hearths of the surviving families, the paradox becomes clear. They mourn the empty spaces at their tables, the children gone, the friends buried. Yet they eat more meat than ever before. They wear better clothes, bought cheaply from the possessions of the dead. They live in larger houses, having moved into homes left behind. One evening, a father leans back after supper, salted pork and cheese where once there would have been only coarse bread, and says quietly, almost guiltily, "We live better now than we ever did before." His wife nods, her eyes on the children, healthier than she ever dreamed they could be. Both know the truth. Their comfort is built upon the graves of half their village. It is this uneasy mixture, grief and plenty, death and renewal, that defines the Europe of 1352. Globe showing Europe-Africa, the beginning of a new world. Globe showing Europe-Africa. Though the survivors cannot see the full arc of history, we can. The great mortality has not only altered their daily lives, it has shaken the foundations of European society. Labor shortages, shifting diets, and cracks in the authority of lords and priests will ripple outward through the decades. In those ripples lie the slow birth of something new, the decline of feudalism, the stirrings of social mobility, and in time, the intellectual flowering we will call the Renaissance. For now, though, in the year 1352, it is simply a village with too many empty cottages and too much silence. And yet, life continues. Fields are plowed, children laugh, bells toll in the little church. Humanity endures, reshaping itself in the shadow of loss. Sheaf of rice, the struggle for labor in a shrunken world. Sheaf of rice. By 1352, the simple arithmetic of survival dictates everything. Fields still demand plowing, seed must be sown, sheep tended, cloth woven, roofs mended. Death has not lessened the needs of life. It has only stripped away the hands that meet them. For those who remain, this reality creates something entirely new in medieval Europe. Leverage. Consider Thomas Fletcher, a ploughman in our village. Before the plague, Thomas rose before dawn 6 days each week, bound by custom and obligation to work the domain, the Lord's land, in exchange for a modest strip of soil he could cultivate for his family. Complaints about long hours or unfair treatment would have gained him nothing. Dozens of others, desperate for work, stood ready to take his place. Now that balance has shifted. When the Lord's steward approaches Thomas in the spring of 1352, it is not with demands but with concessions. The steward offers him a larger strip of land, reduces his service from 6 days to 3, and, most astonishingly, grants him the right to hire out his labor for wages on other estates when his lord's fields are tended. What would once have been unthinkable is now necessary. Without Thomas's skill with a heavy plow and his steady team of oxen, whole fields will remain fallow. Scenes like this unfold across Europe. Survivors find themselves in a position their forebears could scarcely imagine. They can bargain, they can choose. And in choosing, they begin to dismantle the foundations of feudal obligation that have bound generations to the soil. Hammer and pick, the rise of the skilled worker. Hammer and pick. If plowmen gain new freedoms, skilled artisans find themselves courted like never before. Masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, and weavers, once common craftsmen eking out modest livelihoods, now command astonishing wages. A carpenter who once worked for little more than food and a thatched roof for his family, now builds 2-room cottages with glazed windows for himself. His wife wears dyed wool instead of rough homespun. Meat appears on their table 3 times a week. Blacksmiths refuse small jobs unless they are well compensated. Masons travel from village to village, demanding and receiving wages triple what they once earned. For the surviving artisans, it feels like a golden age bought at a terrible price. For nobles and wealthy merchants, it feels like the collapse of the natural order. Balance scale, the backlash of authority. Balance scale. Alarmed at these changes, rulers and elites across Europe scramble to halt them. They see peasants stepping into roles once reserved for their betters, common laborers dressing in fine cloth, demanding respect, even mobility. The fear is not only economic, it is social. If peasants can negotiate wages, what next? Will they begin to question the very legitimacy of noble privilege? In England, King Edward III's government moves swiftly. In 1349, the Ordinance of Labourers is issued. It is followed 2 years later by the Statute of Labourers, 1351, a more comprehensive attempt to restore the old order. These laws forbid employers from offering higher wages than those customary before the plague. They require all able-bodied people under 60 to accept employment when offered, at the old rates. They ban peasants from moving to another village in search of better pay. Prices for food and essential goods are fixed by decree. The pattern repeats across Europe. In France, King John II issues wage controls in 1351. In Florence, the city fathers pass strict ordinances against overpaying workers. In Castile, royal edicts attempt to freeze the peasantry to their home villages. Everywhere, rulers try to hold back the tide. But the tide is stronger. Hole, loopholes, and resistance hoe. On the ground, enforcement proves nearly impossible. Local officials themselves depend on good relations with their peasants and craftsmen. They know that to fine or imprison one laborer only worsens an already crippling shortage. Workers quickly discover ways to outweed the statutes. A carpenter accepts gifts of bread, cheese, or clothing alongside his official pay. A plowman insists his oxen are too weak to work unless offered a larger ration of grain. A spinner works deliberately slowly unless promised extra coin at the end of the day. The system of control becomes a game of cat and mouse, and the workers usually win. The very mathematics of plague society make resistance inevitable. Before the Black Death, a manor might have commanded the labor of 100 peasants. Now it has 50, perhaps fewer. Each one who rebels or who leaves for greener fields represents a crippling loss. Lords may fume, kings may legislate, but necessity is relentless. Globe showing Europe-Africa Europe, in transition globe showing Europe-Africa. The plague has not overthrown the social order outright. Kings still rule, nobles still own vast estates, the church still commands obedience. Yet beneath the surface, cracks are spreading. The old certainties that peasants are plentiful, that wages are fixed, that the poor have no choice, are gone. In their place grows a new and dangerous idea. That common people can negotiate, that labor has value, that survival itself gives them power. The rulers of Europe sense the danger. The workers of Europe begin to taste its promise. Out of this tension, new conflicts will emerge. Conflicts that will echo for centuries. The plague has left its mark not only on the body of Europe but on its spirit. For centuries, peasants had been told their station was divinely ordained, to till the soil, to pay tithes, to serve their lords without question. But when half of Christendom lies buried, when kings and bishops prove as vulnerable to pestilence as plowmen, those old certainties no longer carry the same weight. By the late 1350s, this new consciousness erupts into violence. In France, still reeling from the devastation of the 100 Years' War, peasants in the regions around Paris rise in fury. This Jacquerie of 1358 is born of desperation, crushing taxes, the burden of war, and the heavy hand of nobles who have survived while so many common folk perish. Villagers seize arms, attack castles, and burn noble estates. For a brief moment, the great fear of the elite comes true. The world turned upside down. The revolt is put down savagely. Thousands of peasants slaughtered in reprisals. Yet the memory of their defiance lingers. Never again can the ruling classes entirely trust the patience of those who feed them. In England, tensions simmer longer, like coals beneath ash. For decades after the Black Death, laws such as the Statute of Labourers attempt to chain workers back to their old place. But the gap between command and reality only grows. By 1381, the spark is lit. That summer, tens of thousands of peasants, artisans, and discontented townsfolk converge on London in what becomes known as the Peasants' Revolt. They are led by Wat Tyler, Jack Straw, and a fiery preacher named John Ball. Ball's sermons echo through history. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? With a single question, he shatters centuries of feudal logic. If all descended from the same first man and woman, why should some live in privilege while others toil in misery? The rebels demand the end of serfdom, the abolition of the hated poll tax, and greater justice for common people. For a few heady days, it seems the old world might collapse entirely. But as in France, force and deception prevail. Royal promises are broken. Leaders are executed. The rebellion is crushed. Yet suppression cannot erase what has been awakened. The knowledge that common folk can rise, can speak, can demand. The memory of revolt, like the plague itself, lingers in Europe's bloodstream. Houses, the transformation of towns and cities house it. The countryside is not alone in its transformation. Cities, once bursting at the seams, are emptied in a matter of months. Florence, jewel of Italy, loses as much as 3/4 of its people. Whole streets fall silent, workshops close, and great palaces stand deserted. And yet, in the ruins, opportunity blooms. Where once apprentices waited years for the chance to rise, now they step almost overnight into the place of dead masters. In guild halls across Europe, gaps appear that must be filled. Orphans of plague victims are taken in and trained, rising quickly to full status. In many trades, the careful ladder of advancement is shortened or abandoned altogether. Housing, once scarce and dear, suddenly lies vacant. Survivors move into larger homes or acquire properties at a fraction of their former cost. Families who once crowded into single rooms now spread out into half-empty houses. The very shape of urban life changes. Most striking is the place of women. Before the plague, guild rules and custom barred them from independent practice in most trades. At best, they assisted husbands, sons, or fathers. But when half the guild dies, rules bend. Take Margarita, the weaver's widow of a modest market town. She knows the loom as well as any man, for she worked beside her husband for years. When plague takes him, the guild faces a choice: uphold its ban on female masters and lose her skill, or admit her. Necessity triumphs. Margarita joins the guild in her own right, weaving cloth that sells briskly in the shrunken but hungry market. She is one of many women across Europe who, for a generation, step into roles once barred to them. Though some of these doors will close again as populations recover, for decades women enjoy freedoms in work and income their mothers could scarcely dream of. Performing arts culture in the shadow of death. Performing arts. The plague also alters the very imagination of Europe. Before, the certainty of heaven and hell gave order to life and death. After, art and literature become haunted by images of mortality. Church walls and manuscripts fill with danse macabre, the dance of death, where skeletons lead pope and king, knight and maiden alike to the grave. Death is no respecter of rank, a lesson seared into Europe's consciousness by the sight of nobles and beggars alike carried to the same pits. Yet the obsession with death is only half the story. Alongside grim memento mori grows a renewed passion for life. Survivors dress in vivid colors, drink more wine, sing more loudly, and cherish the fleeting pleasures of the world. Clothing becomes extravagant, layered, and bright. Wealthy merchants commission great works of art and architecture, determined to leave their mark before fate claims them too. Out of this paradox, death's shadow and life's intensity, the seeds of the Renaissance begin to sprout. Dress-shifting symbols of status and style. Dress. In the decades after the Black Death, Europe's appearance begins to change in subtle but unmistakable ways. The coarse wool and drab linen that had clothed peasants for centuries give way, for those who can afford it, to garments of surprising richness. Dyes once considered too expensive for common folk. Deep reds, vivid greens, and even shades of blue once reserved for the wealthy, begin appearing in village squares and market towns. The nobility, already unsettled by peasants demanding wages and tenants bargaining for lower rents, now watch in alarm as artisans' wives appear in silk hoods, or prosperous millers order doublets trimmed with fur. To them, this is more than a fashion statement. It is a challenge to the hierarchy that defined medieval society. In response, rulers across Europe issue sumptuary laws, elaborate codes dictating who may wear what fabrics, colors, and ornaments. An English statute forbids yeomen from wearing velvet. In Florence, a city council decree specifies that only noblewomen may wear pearl-studded gowns. In France, laws insist that fur-lined garments belong only to knights and their betters. But enforcement is patchy at best. Officials are reluctant to fine or punish their neighbors for wearing a forbidden sleeve or lace. And where wealth is sufficient, people find ways around the laws, disguising silk as finely spun wool, or bribing tailors to ignore the restrictions. The mere fact that such laws multiply in the late 14th century reveals how much the old visual distinctions between noble and commoner have begun to blur. Church faith in crisis. Church. If clothing reveals outward change, religion exposes the inner turmoil of a plague-stricken continent. The Church, the most powerful institution in medieval life, emerges from the catastrophe shaken and diminished. Many parishes, once the centers of spiritual and communal life, lose their priests entirely. In some villages, survivors wait years before a replacement can be appointed. Monasteries, with their crowded dormitories and communal dining halls, suffer mortality rates even higher than towns. Entire orders disappear, their libraries dispersed, their chants silenced. With them vanish centuries of carefully copied manuscripts, practical medical knowledge, and fragments of ancient texts. The theological questions are even more devastating. If plague is divine punishment, why are abbots struck down while drunkards live? If prayer is protection, why are entire convents emptied while taverns remain half full? Why do the bells of cathedrals toll just as often for the pious as for the negligent? Two broad responses emerge. Some survivors turn to extreme devotion, believing their survival to be evidence of God's special favor. Flagellant movements, already present before the plague, swell again. Bands of penitents march barefoot from town to town, scourging themselves in public squares, hoping their blood will atone for mankind's sins. Others pour money into religious endowments, building chantry chapels or funding masses for the dead. But another current flows alongside this one: skepticism. If the church cannot explain, cannot protect, and cannot comfort, perhaps it does not hold all the answers. A quieter but more revolutionary spirit begins to stir. Not yet the Reformation, but its distant foreshadow. Men and women begin to wonder whether truth might be found outside the cloister and the pulpit. In books, in nature, in human reason. Books, the broadening of knowledge books. This questioning spirit finds fertile soil in the economic changes of the age. With more food available and fewer mouths to feed, even artisans and merchants now have leisure to think beyond survival. Wealth no longer belongs exclusively to hereditary nobles. Enterprising townsmen and prosperous farmers can afford to educate their children. Schools, once confined to cathedral precincts or monastery cloisters, begin to appear in towns and larger villages. Some focus on practical skills, arithmetic for trade, literacy for contracts and record-keeping. Others emphasize Latin grammar and classical texts, opening the door to broader intellectual horizons. The labor shortage also encourages technological innovation. With fewer workers to thresh grain or hammer iron, machines take their place. Watermills, already used for grinding flour, are adapted to full cloth, power bellows, and crush ore. In the Low Countries, windmills rise on the horizon, harnessing breezes to drain fields and drive hammers. Even the production of knowledge itself begins to shift. Scribes, once plentiful in monasteries, are now scarce and costly. Their wages rise, and with them the price of books. For centuries, the scarcity of labor had been a brake on literacy and scholarship. Now, the pressure to find alternatives accelerates invention. By the mid-15th century, this demand will bear fruit in Johannes Gutenberg's movable type printing press, a direct descendant of the post-plague need to make books more widely and cheaply available. Cyclone, the shattering of tradition. Cyclone. Perhaps the most profound change is not any single law, fashion, or invention, but a new way of thinking. Before the Black Death, medieval Europeans lived within a framework that felt eternal. Kings ruled by divine right, priests mediated between God and man, peasants tilled the land as their fathers had before them. Change, when it came, was slow, almost invisible. The plague shatters that illusion. In the span of a single generation, half of Europe dies. Estates crumble, monasteries fall silent, and hierarchies tremble. What once seemed immovable proves fragile. Survivors come to see the world not as something fixed, but as something that can be altered. By necessity, by human effort, even by choice. That recognition, born of grief, hunger, and survival, is the seed from which the Renaissance will grow. Out of the bones of plague-struck Europe rises a new spirit. Skeptical, creative, hungry for beauty and knowledge, convinced that tradition is not destiny. New Moon, living in the shadow of the Black Death. New Moon. The greatest legacy of the Black Death is not found in the vast cemeteries that dot Europe, nor in the abandoned villages swallowed by weeds, but in the subtle shift of what people believed to be possible. For centuries, the medieval world had seemed fixed, its hierarchies ordained by God, its rhythms dictated by custom, its opportunities bound by birth. The plague did not merely kill millions. It loosened the mortar of that ancient structure, so that cracks began to appear in walls once thought unshakable. Suddenly, new arrangements could be imagined. Labor might be exchanged for wages rather than bound in servitude. Women, once confined to the background of guild workshops, could step into full membership. Children of peasants might aspire to the priesthood or to literacy, things unthinkable only a generation before. Most of these experiments were tentative, many fleeting, but the psychological barrier against change, the quiet voice that once said, "This is how it has always been and how it must remain," grew weaker with every passing year. Sheaf of rice, ordinary lives, extraordinary adjustments sheaf of rice. Yet to those living in the late 14th century, this was not the decline of feudalism or the dawn of modern Europe. For them, it was the business of daily survival and cautious adaptation. Thomas the Ploughman did not know he was undermining serfdom when he bargained for shorter workdays and more meat for his family. He was only trying to secure enough food so his children might live through the winter. Margarita the weaver did not set out to challenge guild laws or redefine the role of women. She only wished to use her loom to keep herself fed after the death of her husband. And yet, multiplied across tens of thousands of villages and towns, these decisions, practical, personal, almost invisible, collectively reshaped European society. Like a river wearing down stone, the countless small negotiations of survivors gradually eroded the rigid structures of medieval life. Derelict house winners and losers in a new economy. Derelict how? Not every change brought improvement. The same labor shortage that enriched peasants and artisans ruined many great landowners. Estates that once flourished collapsed under the weight of debts and the absence of tenants. Noble families, unable to adapt, sold lands they had held for centuries. Churches, monasteries, and hospitals, long dependent on steady rents and generous donations, often struggled as their sources of income dried up. Alms that once fed the poor dwindled. Some hospitals fell into disrepair, unable to support the sick and destitute. In the countryside, abandoned farms sometimes became refuges for bandits and wanderers. In towns, sudden wealth in the hands of young men led to brawling, drunkenness, and petty crime. Municipal governments, their guards depleted and their coffers weakened, found it difficult to keep order. And above it all, plague itself remained a recurring terror. After the Great Wave of the 1340s, smaller outbreaks returned every decade or two, preventing Europe's population from recovering quickly. Families rebuilt, only to be struck again by new deaths. Children grew up knowing that pestilence might sweep away their household at any time. Chart decreasing. The long demographic winter chart decreasing. It was not until the late 15th century that Europe began to experience steady population growth again. In some regions, the recovery would take even longer, into the 16th and even 17th centuries. This long demographic depression meant that the new arrangements created in the aftermath of the plague were not quickly undone. What might have been temporary, higher wages, expanded freedoms, shifting gender roles, instead had time to harden into new customs. By the time the population returned to pre-plague levels, the old feudal order had already been altered beyond repair. Family. The story of one family. Consider once more the village family we have followed. Their story mirrors thousands of others across Europe. The elder brother, once just another peasant boy, finds himself the unexpected heir to two farms. His own and the neighboring plot left vacant when plague claimed an entire household. What was once impossible, a peasant accumulating significant landholdings, now becomes achievable in a countryside half empty. Their father, a carpenter of modest skill before the plague, suddenly finds himself in high demand. The village church, its roof sagging and windows shattered during years of neglect, requires his labor for repairs. Payment for this work is generous, enough to add a second room to the family's cottage, to replace the dirt floor with wooden planks, and to buy a sturdy chest for storing clothes and tools. Small luxuries, yet in the memory of their forebears, unthinkable. Their mother, once a servant in a merchant's household, teaches her children to read. Before the plague, such skill would have been wasted on peasant children. But in this altered world, literacy opens doors to clerical positions, to trade, to opportunities beyond the fields. And one evening, as the family gathers by the fire, their father voices a thought that would have startled his own father. "Perhaps you might become a clerk," he muses, looking at his son. "The abbey needs someone who can read and write. The pay is good, and the work is not hard on the body." The older brother laughs, shaking his head at such a wild idea. But in the mind of the younger child, the suggestion takes root. What once would have been dismissed as absurd, a peasant's son working for the church, handling parchment and ink instead of plows and spades, now seems possible. Globe showing Europe-Africa. The true legacy. Globe showing Europe-Africa. This, perhaps, is the greatest legacy of the Black Death. Not simply that wages rose or that land changed hands, but that possibility itself expanded. That people who once saw the world as immovable now glimpsed the chance of change. In time, this spirit would help fuel the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the birth of modern Europe. But in its earliest form, it lived quietly. In the dreams of a peasant boy, the steady weaving of a widow, the rebuilding of a church, the lesson of a mother teaching her children their letters. It was not grand declarations or royal decrees that reshaped Europe, but millions of small acts of adaptation and hope, born in the shadow of unimaginable loss. DNA, the genetic legacy of survival DNA. As dawn creeps over the horizon of our journey, we begin to see not just the ruins left in the plague's wake, but the enduring traces it etched into the human body itself. The story of the Black Death is not only one of graves, empty villages, and shattered faith. It is also written in the microscopic architecture of our very cells. Remember the CCR5 delta 3-2 mutation we first encountered in the stories of plague survivors. That tiny variation in DNA, no larger than a single misplaced instruction in the vast library of human genes, may have been the difference between life and death for countless people in the 14th century. Those who carried it were less vulnerable to Yersinia pestis, and so, more likely to live long enough to have children. Their descendants, generation after generation, carried the mutation forward, quietly multiplying its presence in the European gene pool. For centuries, no one could know this inheritance existed. It lay dormant, hidden in the double helix, waiting for another moment of trial. Globe showing Europe-Africa from the 14th century to the 20th. Globe showing Europe-Africa. Fast forward 600 years. A very different pandemic emerges. HIV/AIDS, first identified in the late 20th century. This new disease spread swiftly across the globe, devastating communities, baffling scientists, and claiming millions of lives. And yet, amidst this new terror, doctors and researchers notice something astonishing. A small number of people, though repeatedly exposed to HIV, never become infected. They seem to possess a natural shield. When geneticists dig deeper, they uncover the secret. These individuals carry the very same CCR5 delta 3-2 mutation that once protected their medieval ancestors from plague. The connection becomes clear. Both Yersinia pestis in the 14th century and HIV in the 20th exploit the CCR5 protein, a kind of doorway on the surface of human cells. The delta 3-2 mutation alters that doorway, barring entry. What was once an accidental shield against bubonic plague becomes, centuries later, an unexpected defense against an entirely different pathogen. In this way, the survivors of the Black Death, long buried in unmarked graves, reach across time to help protect their distant descendants. Their genetic legacy provides crucial insights that inspire the development of antiretroviral drugs designed to block CCR5, saving lives in a world their medieval minds could never have imagined. Balance scale, the double-edged sword of evolution. Balance scale. But evolution is never a clean or simple bargain. The same immune system traits that made some individuals more resistant to plague may carry hidden costs. Modern scientists have begun to suspect that the intense natural selection of the Black Death shaped not only resistance to infections but also contributed to new vulnerabilities. Certain autoimmune disorders, conditions in which the immune system, sharpened by centuries of battle, sometimes turns against the body itself, are more common in European populations. Crohn's disease, type 1 diabetes, and multiple sclerosis may, in part, represent the unintended consequences of a medieval struggle for survival. In this way, the Black Death continues to whisper in our biology. Every ache of an overactive immune system, every mystery of inherited resistance or vulnerability, carries with it faint echoes of those desperate days when survival was anything but guaranteed. Crystal ball, the long shadow of natural selection. Crystal ball. This is perhaps the most extraordinary truth of plague's legacy. It did not simply shape the economies and faiths of Europe, it shaped human beings themselves. The choices of who lived and who died, determined by genetics as much as by chance or circumstance, altered the evolutionary trajectory of entire populations. And so, when we speak of the Black Death, we are not only speaking of history. We are speaking of something alive within us now, something that travels silently in our blood. The sacrifices of AAM's villagers, the courage of Elizabeth Hancock, the fortune of survivors in countless nameless villages. All of these stories live on, not only in memory, but in the molecular code of their descendants. The Black Death, then, is not truly past. It breathes in our immune systems, guides modern medicine, and reminds us, across 7 centuries, that the boundary between past and present is thinner than it seems. Waxing crescent moon, the long shadow of the Black Death. Society, faith, and culture recast waxing crescent moon. Our ancestors survived the plague in part because their immune systems responded with unusual vigor. Yet that gift came with a price. The same heightened reactivity that once shielded them against Yersinia pestis may have planted the seeds for autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis among their descendants. The lesson is humbling. Pandemics do not simply kill and then vanish, tidily consigned to the past. They leave legacies that endure, encoded in DNA, reshaping bodies, shaping societies, even guiding the evolution of culture itself. The Black Death's impact was not only biological. Its social and economic transformations echoed for generations. Some effects were temporary, fading as Europe's population recovered. Others became woven so deeply into the fabric of daily life that they permanently altered the trajectory of European civilization. Sheaf of rice, the slow unraveling of serfdom. Sheaf of rice. Perhaps the most profound change was the collapse of serfdom in Western Europe. 4 centuries before the plague, peasants had lived bound to the land, obligated to provide labor for their lords in exchange for meager protection and a subsistence existence. In this arrangement, individual freedom was scarce, and upward mobility nearly impossible. But the plague shattered this balance. With so many dead, land became plentiful while labor grew desperately scarce. A serf who once had no bargaining power could suddenly negotiate better terms or simply walk away, knowing another lord would welcome his service. Landlords tried to resist. Across England, France, and the Low Countries, edicts attempted to force peasants back into traditional obligations, to freeze wages, to preserve the old order. But demographic reality undermined every decree. There were simply too few workers to enforce obedience. The chains of serfdom loosened with every passing year. By the end of the Middle Ages, much of Western Europe had transitioned from serfdom to tenancy arrangements. Peasants still tilled the soil, but increasingly they did so as rent-paying tenants, not as hereditary serfs. They owed money, not unending labor. This shift represented a quiet revolution in personal freedom, not total equality, but a step away from the rigid hierarchies that had defined medieval life. Eastern Europe, however, told a different story. There, the nobility responded to the labor crisis by tightening control, binding peasants more firmly to the land in what historians call the second serfdom. In regions like Poland, Hungary, and Russia, lords succeeded in extracting heavier obligations just as their Western counterparts lost ground. This divergence would shape the destinies of these regions for centuries. A West slowly moving toward markets and freedom, and an East where aristocratic dominance and serfdom lingered well into the modern age. Church faith in crisis. The Church after the plague. Church. The Black Death also left deep cracks in the spiritual foundation of Europe. The Catholic Church, long the unchallenged center of medieval life, faltered under the weight of the catastrophe. Many priests and monks had fled their posts when the plague struck, abandoning communities in their hour of need. Others stayed and died, leaving parishes leaderless. Monasteries, often densely populated, suffered catastrophic losses, wiping out centuries of accumulated knowledge in a matter of weeks. More troubling still were the theological questions that the plague raised. Why did prayers, processions, and fasts fail to halt the disease? Why did the devout perish alongside the impious? If God was punishing humanity, why did his wrath fall so indiscriminately? These questions, whispered in grief-stricken households and shouted in angry marketplaces, chipped away at the certainty that the Church held all the answers. For some, the experience led to deeper devotion. Survival was seen as proof of divine favor, and vows of piety multiplied. For others, the opposite was true. Doubt flourished. people began to question whether traditional authorities were as trustworthy or divinely inspired as they claimed. These cracks in faith did not bring immediate revolution. But when the Reformation erupted in the 16th century, the groundwork was already laid. The willingness of millions to break from centuries of Catholic tradition can be traced, in part, to plague-era disillusionment. The catastrophe of the 14th century had prepared the soil in which Martin Luther's challenge and John Calvin's reforms could take root. Skull art after the plague. Death and humanity's skull. Even in the realm of art, the Black Death left a visible mark. Before the plague, medieval art had focused almost exclusively on religious themes: saints, biblical stories, and visions of heaven. After the plague, new motifs appeared, dark but strangely vivid. The dance of death, skeletons leading kings, peasants, and priests alike to the grave, reminded viewers of mortality's universality. Paintings and carvings depicted skulls, graves, and grim reminders that death spared no class or rank. And yet, alongside this macabre imagery came a profound turn toward humanism. The very nearness of death seems to have sharpened people's appetite for life. Painters began to dwell more on human faces, human stories, and earthly pleasures. Still life compositions with fruit, flowers, and fleeting beauty emphasized the fragility, but also the richness, of existence. This shift, at first subtle, grew over the following century into the Renaissance. An embrace of classical learning, of individual achievement, and of the value of human experience itself. Without the rupture of the plague, without the stark reminder that old certainties could crumble overnight, Europe's cultural rebirth might have unfolded very differently, or perhaps not at all. Balance scale. In summary, balance scale. The Black Death was not only a pandemic. It was a turning point that reshaped Europe's economic systems, religious life, and cultural imagination. Serfdom waned in the West while it hardened in the East. Faith was shaken, preparing the way for the Reformation. Art darkened but also became more human, laying foundations for the Renaissance. And beneath it all, unseen, the very biology of survivors carried the scars and the gifts of that struggle into the far future. Waxing crescent moon epilogue. The echo of survival. Crescent moon. The village you picture has changed since we first wandered its quiet lanes. Where once we saw empty cottages with roofs sagging and weeds creeping through abandoned gardens, we now hear the laughter of children. Families once shattered by death have been remade through remarriage and kinship ties, fragile new bonds of community woven from what remained. The elders sit by the hearth on winter evenings, their faces lined not just by age but by memory. They speak of the time when the bells tolled daily, when funerals blurred into one another, when whole families disappeared in the span of a week. They do not dwell on those memories, but they do not forget them either. Their survival is both a burden and a gift, the duty to remember and the chance to see renewal. Life is not the same as before. Never could be. The survivors have tasted hunger and then abundance, grief and then opportunity. They have seen the seemingly immovable pillars of society, serfdom, the authority of the church, the permanence of custom, shift under the weight of catastrophe. Their children grow up in a world where horizons feel wider, where possibility has crept into the spaces once closed by tradition. In this sense, the Black Death's greatest legacy may be neither the biological mutations that guard against disease, nor the economic restructuring that undermined feudalism, nor even the cultural shifts that prepared the way for the Renaissance. Its most enduring gift was the expansion of imagination. Ordinary men and women who once accepted the world as fixed discovered that it could change. That lords might bargain with plowmen, that widows might run workshops, that priests might not have all the answers. That life, even when half extinguished, could be rekindled. This is what resilience looks like across centuries. Not the erasure of suffering, but the weaving of suffering into something new. Globe Showing Europe Africa. The lesson for us. Globe Showing Europe Africa. From our vantage point centuries later, we see the Black Death as a hinge in history. It was a catastrophe that devastated the medieval world, but it also revealed the extraordinary adaptability of the human spirit. That adaptability remains with us. When new pandemics arise, when climate change or natural disasters unsettle our assumptions, when technological disruption shakes old ways of life, the memory of the Black Death reminds us that collapse does not have to mean the end. Survivors can mourn, rebuild, innovate, and carry forward. Communities can falter and then reform in new shapes. Societies can find within tragedy the seeds of transformation. This does not diminish the suffering of those who died in the mid-14th century. Millions of unique lives, each precious, each irreplaceable. But it does remind us that their survival, their resilience, their willingness to adapt, helped create the world we inhabit today. Fire, the final image, fire. As you leave the village one last time, you pause on the hill where the elders buried their dead in hurried graves so many years ago. The grass grows thick here now, sheep graze peacefully, and wildflowers nod in the breeze. From this height, you see the cottages repaired, the fields green with wheat, the children running in the lanes. The bells of the church ring, not in mourning this time, but in celebration of a wedding. Two young people, children of survivors, step into a future their parents once thought impossible. The shadow of the Black Death still lingers, but so too does the light of renewal. And that balance, grief and endurance, mortality and hope, is the deepest legacy of all. Crescent Moon Final Reflections. The continuum of survival. Crescent Moon. They could not have known. Not the plowman who bargained for better terms, nor the widow who took up her husband's loom, nor the grieving mother who buried her children with her own hands. None of them could have imagined that their struggles would ripple outward through centuries, shaping genes, reshaping societies, inspiring art, and laying the groundwork for new ways of understanding health and disease. They simply lived as best they could within the narrow horizon of each day. And in doing so, they revealed that quiet but extraordinary human power. The ability to endure, to adapt, and to begin again when all seems lost. Perhaps that is the most comforting thought to carry with us into sleep. That resilience is not reserved for the heroic few. It is a resource hidden within ordinary lives, revealed only when circumstances demand it. That life itself, fragile though it may be, shows an almost stubborn persistence, finding new paths forward when old ones are broken, blossoming again from ruins. The survivors of the Black Death could never have imagined our world. Cities that light up the night sky, medicines that tame once lethal diseases, communication that bridges continents in an instant. Just as we cannot fully imagine the world our descendants will inherit centuries from now. Yet the thread that connects us is the same. Like those medieval villagers, we face dangers we did not choose. Like them, we discover strengths we did not know we possessed. Every generation bears its share of catastrophe and recovery. Every generation adds its own chapter to the long human story. We carry the wounds of the past, but also the wisdom gained in surviving them. We leave behind our own lessons, our own scars and triumphs, for those who will come after. So rest well tonight, knowing you are part of this unbroken chain, stretching back through plague and famine, through war and fire, through endless trials survived, and stretching forward beyond our sight, into futures yet unimagined. For this is the deepest legacy of the plague survivors. Not only what they lost or even what they changed, but that they continued. That life, against all odds, found ways to endure. And so it shall with us,